gravar e vou começar a transmitir ao vivo. Só um minutinho. Ok, vocês estão ao vivo. Bom evento.
Obrigado, Márcia. Thank you, Professor Ernest Weinrib, for us in the groups of research in law and philosophy of private law that we have here in our university in Porto Alegre. It's an honor to receive you for this presentation. Professor Ernest Weinrib is a professor in the University of Toronto, and he's a scholar that studies this subject of private law and the philosophy of private law. As we are saying, we studied his books since 2000, 2001, and because of that, for us, it's an important moment to have this opportunity to discuss his thoughts, his works today. The presentation today will take
Sorry, you're frozen from my point of view. I can't hear you. Or see, I can see you, but I can't hear you.
He froze for everybody.
Hello?
I believe.
Hello.
I can't hear what Dr. Resch is saying.
Professor, I believe Rafael froze for everybody. Maybe the connection is not working, so probably he will connect.
Okay, now I can hear you.
Professor, I'm sorry, but I believe Rafael is having some technical issues and maybe he's back with us. I'm sorry.
Yes, yeah.
Hello.
Yes, here we are. Yes.
I returned. Sorry,
Good.
we had technical problems. So as I was saying, for us, it's an important moment to have Professor Ernest Weinrib here. And today he will present for us the role of structure in corrective justice. And after that, we can discuss, we can debate about the subject and the presentation. Thank you, Professor Weinrib. So I think you can start now.
Good, thank you. So, as Dr. Dresch says, both my remarks to the idea of structure and the implications of structure, though, as I said in the email that we exchanged, in the discussion afterwards, we can talk about whatever you think is significant, whether it has to do with the exact ambit of my remarks or not. So let me say why I want to start with structure. I think corrective justice, at least the way I've presented it, is unusual in the world of legal theory because it starts with structure. Because I think all theories that I know of, other theories that I know of that deal with private law, start with some set of principles, some set of substantive principles. And that's true of of course, of law and economics, which is a dominant approach to private law theory in North America and beyond. But it's also true of those who call themselves justices, proponents of corrective justice, that their idea of corrective justice focuses on some principles. So my friend Jules Coleman also refers to himself as a corrective justice theorist, but for him, corrective justice is a principle of compensation for wrongful losses. I'm starting from a different point of view, which I think is actually historically more consonant with what corrective justice, how corrective justice was formulated. I'm starting with the idea of structure. And in particular, what I want to focus on is the structure of the reasons for holding one person liable to another. And I think out of that idea of structure comes a certain conception of coherence and a certain conception of fairness. And then also a certain view about what the nature of the content is that's appropriate to the structure. So the whole idea of starting with structure is to start with it, but of course not to finish with it, because any theory of private law, any theory of law has to move from structural concerns to substantive concerns. That's what I intend to do in my remarks this morning. So let me first of all turn to the page that I asked Dr. Dresch to distribute to you, entitled 14 Theses about Corrective Justice. These 14 propositions about corrective justice. And I hope you've had a chance to look at that, or at least have it in front of you now, as I'm going to go through it and add my own commentary as I go through it. I think, at least I'm going to claim, or maybe pretend, that these 14 theses state fairly obvious implications of a certain starting point. I say fairly obvious implications, even though I'm aware that it took me about 30 years to write this page. This page is itself the result of a long period of gestation, but I think it sums up the picture of structure with which I want to work in the analysis of private law. So as I say, 14 theses about corrective justice. I sometimes think that I should get another, I should bring the number of theses up to 95 and nail them onto my office door, following the precedent of another person who thought it had certain theses. But anyway, there are 14 theses. And thesis number 1, as you see, is liability, correction, and justice. I take it that this is a perfectly obvious statement, in the sense that that one would not disagree with this statement unless one had some special commitment, prior commitment, to see the world in a certain way. I think otherwise, for legal analysis, the idea that liability creates an injustice, corrects an injustice, is not controversial. What else could liability be doing? But what I want to say is that if you grant me this perfectly obvious, what I regard as a perfectly obvious proposition, then all sorts of conclusions follow from it that are completely at odds with the other strands of private law theory. And I want to go through these other propositions, and then I'll, with some comments, and then draw some implications from them. So, proposition number one, thesis number one, liability corrects an injustice. Thesis number two, which I think is also, in my view, obvious on its face, that liability is a correlatively structured phenomenon. That is, that the liability of a particular defendant is a liability to a particular plaintiff. That in private law, the idea of liability always links a particular defendant and a particular plaintiff through the correlativity of its own structure. Again, I don't, even though the language may be a bit pretentious in this second thesis, I don't regard it as particularly controversial from the standpoint of juridical assumptions. So, two, the liability is a correlatively structured phenomenon. The liability of a particular defendant is liability to a particular plaintiff. Three, the injustice that's corrected is correlatively structured. And I say that follows from 1 and 2. That is, that if liability corrects an injustice, and liability is correlatively structured, it must be that the injustice being corrected is correlatively structured. So I think proposition 3 follows from propositions 1 and 2. That brings us to 4. Injustice is not a brute event, but a normative ascription on the basis of reasons. That is, when we think of something as an injustice, we presuppose that we have certain reasons for thinking of it as an injustice. So the injustice is not a brute event, but a normative description on the basis of reasons. And now I'm going to draw from that, that is from 3 and 4, that is, that injustice is relatively structured, and injustice is a normative ascription on the basis of reason. I'm going to draw from that proposition 5. The reasons for considering something an injustice are also relatively structured. The reasons are relatively structured. And then that brings us to the question, what does it mean for reasons to be correlatively structured? So, proposition 6, the reasons are relatively structured, even if only if they employ concepts that are relatively structured. We reason with concepts. If the reasons are relatively structured, it must be that they employ concepts that are relatively structured. So, from our starting point, that liability corrects an injustice, we've come in 5 propositions, in 6 propositions, to a view, a perspective on the nature of the reasons that are relevant to liability. So, but what are these concepts that are relatively structured, that are relevant to liability? So, Proposition 7 and the obligation correlative to it are the concepts that underlie liability. Right, and the obligation correlative to it are the concepts that underlie liability. Now, what do we mean by right and the concepts and the obligation correlative to it? Brings us to Proposition 8. The existence of the right and its correlative obligation is justificatory. That is, it goes to the reason for liability and is not merely a conclusion attached to it, to the finding of liability. And you can see from the parenthesis that my claim is that that follows from 4 and 7. That is, it follows from the idea that injustice is an ascription on the basis of reasons. And 7, the right and the obligation correlative to it are the concepts that underlie liability. So we're looking, so the existence of the right is justificatory. It goes to the reason for liability, not merely a conclusion attached to the finding of liability. So what I'm trying to preempt in that Proposition 8 is the idea that, well, a right can be whatever we declare it to be. And then we just work it in to the structure that we have. That anything can be a right. That's whether something is a right is just an act of our will, as it were. It's just we can decide whatever we want is a right. So we can have a right to anything, and if the legal system subscribes to that right, then we have a right. And I want to say, no, that's not the way rights fit into this structure. That we're looking for the reason for liability and not merely a conclusion attached to a finding of liability. And I say that follows from Theses 4 and 7. Now, in Thesis 8, I referred to the existence of the right and its correlative obligation. And I want to just now in 9 make a statement about that correlativity of right and obligation. So 9, the justificatory ground of the right, that is, what accounts for the role of the right in providing a reason for liability under 8, is correlative to the justificatory ground for the obligation. In a sense, that just states in a few extra words what it means to talk about a right and its correlative obligation from the standpoint of the justificatory ground of the right. And I say that Proposition 9, Thesis 9, follows from Theses 5 and 8. Okay. Now, if you're still with me at this point, I want to move on to Thesis 10, which begins the first of several theses that specify the nature of the right and the correlative obligation. So Thesis 10 states is stated in a negative way. That is, what this justificatory right cannot be. The justificatory ground for the right cannot consist in the welfare of the right holder, the welfare that the right holder realizes from the right's existence, because welfare is not a correlatively structured concept. I say that follows from 5 and 9, right? That the justificatory ground for the right itself has to be correlatively structured. And therefore, welfare cannot be the ground of the right in private law, because welfare is something that is not correlatively structured. It's something that a person either has or doesn't have. But there's no correlative relationship between welfare the welfare of one person and the obligation of any other particular person. So the effect of 10, which, as I say, is simply following through on the progression of propositions from our obvious starting point, liability corrects a right, corrects an injustice. The effect of 10 is to disqualify all welfare or interest theories of right. And since interest theories of right or welfare theories of rights are, I suppose, the predominant version for rights theory, the predominant version of rights, the effect of thesis 10 is to set corrective justice apart from all interest theories of rights, and therefore to set it apart from most of the legal theory that is put forward as a theory of rights. So, as I said, sentence 10, proposition 10, stated the matter negatively. That is, whatever the justificatory ground for right is, it is not the welfare of the right holder. So that brings us to thesis 11, which states the justificatory ground positively. If it's not welfare, what is it? So here we have a proposition 11, thesis 11, and this is the most probably the most complex of these propositions, and I can't do full justice to it in this survey, but it's an essential part of the picture that I want to present, and so I want to go over it a little bit. The justificatory ground for the right consists in the right's role in actualizing a legal regime of equal reciprocal freedom. That is, a regime in which one can act for one's purposes, whatever they are, so long as one's actions are consistent with the equal freedom of others to act for their purposes. And the inspiration for this, more than the inspiration, what I'm doing is merely copying and translating the beginning of Kant's doctrine of right, the famous statement, the concept of right is the totality of conditions under which the action of one person can coexist with the freedom of another. That idea, the concept of right, is the totality of conditions under which the action of one person can coexist with the freedom of another is saying in a much shorter compass and probably more accurately what I was saying in a sentence before, in the previous sentence of this thesis, that is, that the justificatory ground for a right consists of the right's role in actualizing a legal regime of equal reciprocal freedom. That is a regime in which one can act for one's purposes, whatever they are, so long as one's actions are consistent with the freedom of others to act for their purposes. So within a legal regime of equal reciprocal freedom, the parties are correlatively situated as interactor and interactee on terms of equality. So that word interactee, I suppose, is a neologism. It's a rather awkward formulation. But what I'm trying to do in that sentence is capture the sheer reciprocity of interaction and the role of rights in actualizing a regime that respects the sheer reciprocity of interaction. And then I add in Proposition 11 that equal reciprocal freedom provides the conditions under which Proposition 7, remember, is the right of the obligation correlative to it are the concepts that underlie liability. So it provides the conditions under which 7 conforms to to thesis 9. So that brings us to thesis 12. Within a regime of equal reciprocal freedom, rights are adverbial. That is, they govern how persons are to go about pursuing their self-chosen purposes. And I should add, their self-chosen purposes in view of their effects on others, not what the purposes have to be. And I take that as an implication of 11. And one way of thinking of thesis 12 is that within corrective justice, and I think generally within private law, though some of you may disagree with this, within corrective justice, rights are entirely negative, not positive. They don't tell you what you have to do. They tell you, private law does not tell you what you have to do. It tells you what you may not do. It's negative, that is, it insists that you act in a way that conforms to the rights of others. It doesn't tell you to do anything in particular. What you do is your own choice, but you have to do it in a way that respects the freedom of others. And respecting the freedom of others is to respect the rights of others, conceived in the way that I'm presenting them in these theses. And that's what thesis 13 says explicitly. The various kinds of rights, so property rights to property, right to personal integrity, right to contractual performance, a right to another's observance of a fiduciary obligation. The various kinds of rights are the juridical conduits through which persons interact on terms of their equal reciprocal freedom. Now that's a very bold statement. And of course, I'm not saying anything here to more about those rights, though I'd be happy to if you wanted to press me during the discussion period. I'm just pointing to the role of rights within this structure of corrective justice as the juridical conduits through which persons interact on terms of their equal reciprocal freedom. Of course, to confirm Proposition 13, Thesis 13, what one would have to set out and discuss a fair range of private law rights. And I'm not doing that in this presentation, though I'm happy to talk about these things if you want. But some of that work I did in my book on corrective justice, which deals with various bases of liability. So the idea of private law is being, the example that it takes is being a tort law, the law of Direito. My book on corrective justice deals a little bit with tort law, but also with contract law, and the law of remedies, and unjust enrichment, and property. And such a work is the necessary is necessary in order to confer what I'm saying very sketchily in Thesis 13. But the reason I'm including Thesis 13 in this very sketchy way is just to show how rights figure within this overall approach to private law theory. And that brings us to the final thesis, 14. An inconsistency with the plaintiff's right that is imputable to the defendant is an injustice that liability can correct. An inconsistency with the plaintiff's right that is imputable to the defendant. So again, that's very broad language. I don't want to say an inconsistency with plaintiff's rights that is caused by the defendant, though that's included, because I also want to allow room for unjust enrichment, which deals, in my view, and as I explained in Corrective Justice, in my book, Corrective Justice, deals with an inconsistency with the plaintiff's right that the defendant may not have brought about, but that the defendant is still responsible for correcting. So that completes the 14 theses, and you see that the 14th thesis, an inconsistency with the plaintiff's right that is imputable to the defendant, is an injustice that liability can correct. You see that that actually echoes the very first thesis. Liability corrects an injustice. So I started with liability corrects an injustice, a very bold statement. And now I fleshed it out through these 14 theses, solely by attending to the structure implicit in this statement, liability corrects an injustice. I fleshed that out with a conception of what an injustice, broadly speaking, is. So those are the 14 theses that I think state in a very summary way the main, the progression of thought that leads me to suggest corrective justice. The version of corrective justice, the structural version of corrective justice that I've been putting forward. Now, let me say, in the time that's remaining, let me make a few additional comments about this structure as I laid it out. So implicit in the structure are two normative conceptions. One is a conception of fairness. That is, what is normatively relevant to the relationship as such, not to either of the parties taken individually. The conception of fairness is entirely relational and fits this structure. So there's no independent substantive judgment about fairness. It's not that we start with an idea of fairness and develop the implications of that substantive idea of fairness. The idea of fairness, I think, is an implication of the structure of corrective justice. And the main point of that fairness, the salient point of that idea of fairness, is that one cannot justify liability by any reason that is one-sidedly referential to one or the other part of the parties. That it would be unfair to prejudice one party because of a one-sided consideration that pertains to the other party. So the conception of fairness has to be entirely relational in the way that I've set out. And I think this also disqualifies, actually, the economic analysis of law, among various other approaches as well. And the second concept implicit in the structure of corrective justice, as I've laid it out, is a conception of coherence. That is, that the relationship forms a unity, which I take it to be always the distinctive feature of coherence. That is not mere consistency, but coherence. This is not pluralistic. And it allows the reasoning, it insists that the reasoning, legal reasoning, have a justificatory force that is coterminous with the entirety of the relationship's normative space. So fairness deals with the standing of the parties as equals within correlatively structured reasoning, and coherence deals with reasoning that is adequate to the correlatively structured relationship. Now, this view that I've put forward is internal, I think in every possible way, internal to private law. That is, it starts with the structure that we see in private law, the structure of the plaintiff's action against the defendant, and is interested in the concepts that pertain to that structure. It's internal in that it examines the law's concepts from the standpoint of the law's own aspiration to fairness and coherence. And fairness and coherence are internal to the structure of the relationship. That's just what I spelled out. And the structure itself is the internal composition of the nexus between the plaintiff and the defendant. So this is as far as I would maintain, is a purely internal view of private law and of the theory that it presupposes. Now, one might ask, and perhaps I could end with these observations. One might ask whether corrective justice is interpretive or normative. I say one might ask this because over the last 40 years in which I've been presenting these ideas, people often do ask me this: is it interpretive or is it normative? And my answer is that it's both. So let me start with interpretive. What do I mean by interpretive? So of course, large literature on interpretation. I just want to say what I mean by interpretation in accordance with this view that I'm presenting. To interpret is to understand the normative significance of some aspect of private law in relation to the larger whole of which it forms a part. I think that's the way we do interpret, as a matter of the common law. At any rate, we try to see whether a certain conception of, say, the duty of care and negligence is consistent with the larger conception of what a duty of care is. And one can continue up the stream of abstractions, culminating in corrective justice, which is the most inclusive unity with reference to which the reasoning about liability can be understood as coherent. So the interpretive dimension of corrective justice is animated by the corrective justice conception of coherence. The normative dimension is animated by corrective justice's conception of fairness. That is, corrective justice has supreme regulative status because it pertains to the most inclusive abstraction of all, namely structure. So corrective justice requires us to hold the particulars of private law to their conformity with the structure of corrective justice. So that's a normative exercise that's animated by the corrective justice conception of fairness. So on this view, the interpretive and the normative are intertwined. That is, I'm not deriving the normative from the interpretive, nor the interpretive from the normative. So in this connection, this is different from, say, Dworkin, who tries to move from the interpretive nature of law to its normative dimension. I'm saying, no, that's not what's involved in this line of thinking. The interpretive and the normative are intertwined. And that's because, so I said that the interpretive has to do with fairness and the normative has to do with coherence. Sorry, the interpretive has to do with coherence and the normative has to do with fairness. So when I'm saying that the interpretive and the normative are intertwined, what follows from that is that no incoherence in private law can be fair. And no fairness can be incoherent. The two are intertwined conceptions. So perhaps this might be an appropriate point at which for me to stop the initial part of our meeting. So I've tried to set out, starting with the idea of structure, tried to set out in very broad strokes through the 14 propositions how one moves from structure to substance, then draw implications about from structure about fairness and coherence of private law reasoning, and from that make some observations about the interpretive and the normative dimensions of corrective justice. So perhaps I should stop there and entertain your reactions and comments at this point.
Good, very good. Thank you again, Professor
I'm gonna have
Ryan.
to stop for a moment. My sound has sort of gone off. Let me just.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, that's okay. Good.
It's okay. So thank you again. And now I will open for everybody to react, to present questions and comments. So people, if you want to start. I have my questions, but I can wait. Anyone? We have today here with us Professor Luis Fernando Barzotto. That's our professor here in the subject of philosophy of law. But Professor Barzotto today is with COVID. He's fine, he's okay, but I think today he's just in listeners because of this problem. Arthur Feijó, yes, you can ask a question. You can open your microphone.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. Professor Weinrib, thank you very much for your class. It's a privilege to be here learning with you. I'd like to ask you if it's possible to visualize in the criminal law and also in the civil law, the civil punitive sanctions, such as punitive damage in the concept of corrective justice. Is it possible, Professor? Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a very significant question. So, in my view, it's not possible to incorporate punitive damages into corrective justice because punitive damages look at the outrageousness of the defendant's conduct taken on its own, and is not a kind of damages that is correlatively structured. So I've always held that punitive damages have no place in private law. I understand that that's the position taken by many civil law jurisdictions as well, though not all of them. For a while, I thought it would be the position taken by the common law as well. That is, back in the 70s, there were a series of decisions of the House of Lords that severely restricted punitive damages in England. But the English courts have compromised on that a bit, and courts in other common law jurisdictions have not gone in that direction at all. And so I've been, for instance, very critical in my own country of the way the Supreme Court of Canada has extended punitive damages to contract law. And in my book on Corrective Justice, I have a chapter on punitive damages, where I try to set out the reasons for thinking that punitive damages have no place within the private law. But that's a position that is, I have to acknowledge, is a minority position among common law scholars and jurisdictions. I was hoping I would get some support on that from our civil law colleagues, but I don't know whether that's actually the case or not. I think, at least in some jurisdictions, our civil law colleagues are also having doubts about the exclusion of punitive damages from private law. And so let me just add one other corollary to that. What it means is that one thing that it means is that one has to recognize, if I'm right, one has to recognize the distinction between private law and criminal law. And one needs a special theory of criminal law that makes that distinction. And again, in the book on, entitled Corrective Justice, I offer such a view, but it's just a sketch of such a view. So I hope anyway, so I hope that's a response to your question. I'd be interested in knowing whether you think I'm mistaken in my exclusion of punitive damages.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much. I've been studying about that, and I'm not sure yet about the conclusion. I'm not sure, but maybe in the concept of punishments, the idea of correcting the general wrong in the society has some kind of a relation in the corrective justice, but I'm not sure about that also.
Well, I have to confess that as I was finishing this the book that is now coming out, that's now with the Oxford University Press, I thought of including a chapter on criminal law and expanding on remarks that I've made about the nature of criminal law. But in the end, I decided not for any very valid reason. I wanted to basically finish it and get on with the next project. And for me to do a chapter on criminal law would have taken 6 months to a year, because I don't teach criminal law. I'd have to familiarize myself with criminal law. And I feel very reluctant to write about subjects, legal areas that I don't teach. So I decided in the end, maybe in the future, but not now. But I can understand your hesitation. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arthur. Now I think Henry is the next one. Henry, you can pose your question, please.
Can you see me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Weinrib. I'm sorry for my bad English, but I was something in your exposition that cast a kind of a doubt. Your proposition of corrective justice as this center, this reason that everything in private law is corrective justice. Sometimes, and punitive damages is an example of it. It seems that positive law diverges of the structures of corrective justice. Punitive damages, the doctrine of unconscionability in contract law, and other things. Would you consider that those phenomena of positive law seemingly diverging of the structure of corrective justice is something wrong, something that we should normatively avoid, or is just something that we can admit in some situations, but that are outside the scope of theorization about private law? Something like, I don't know, public law intrusions in the regime of private law. Would you? It's not clear to me if you claim to exclude every considerations external to corrective justice in what we doctrinally call private law, or maybe just cannot make sense of these inclusions in terms of private law. I don't know if I made myself clear.
Yes. I think I understand your question, and thank you for it. So um, sorry. So one thing that I omitted to do in my presentation was actually talk very much about positive law itself, right? I presented a scheme in a very abstract way, starting with the idea that liability corrects an injustice, and expanded on what that means through the 14 theses, and then drew some implications from it, and noted the interpretive and normative dimensions of it. And I didn't actually talk about the positive law. And so you're quite right to then ask me, well, what about the positive law? What about these particular features of the positive law? So, so what I would say about the idea of corrective justice, the way I presented it this morning, does not take as its basis the fact that it may or may not map onto all the particular doctrines of private law. So how do we get from that scheme to the doctrines? Well, in my view, if one accepts that corrective justice provides a conception of coherence and fairness that's relevant to private law relations, it stands to reason, just as a first approximation, that it would be reflected in the law, because whatever else those who compose the law do, whether codifying or in the common law through judgments, whatever else they're doing, they're aiming for fairness and coherence. So that, and it's always a reproach to them. It's always a perfectly legitimate criticism, a devastating criticism to their efforts. If one points out that what they have done is not coherent or not fair, and that's accepted universally as a basis for criticism. So it would stand to reason, at least at first blush, that that the doctrines of law, or the basic ideas that under which those doctrines are presented, are in conformity with corrective justice. So I've tried to explain. So in my own development, I came to discuss these issues of corrective justice, these larger theoretical issues, from my teaching of tort law. So I would teach both. I've taught standard teaching mode, as I teach both tort law, the common law of torts, and the Roman law of Direito. So I think the structure of those ideas is consistent with corrective justice, though not every particular doctrine is consistent with corrective justice. And whether it's consistent with corrective justice or not is a matter of interpretation. And hence, I emphasize the interpretive dimension of corrective justice. And what matters for interpretation is that more general ideas are more significant interpretively than more particular ideas. And I think that corrective justice does supply a way of understanding the concepts of private law, though not necessarily every particular doctrine of private law. And therefore, I would say given the interpretive and normative dimensions of corrective justice, doctrines whose reasons are not conforming to corrective justice are mistaken. And I think any theory, any normative theory has to have some version of what a legal mistake is. That is, a normative theory is not a scientific theory. It's not that we're trying to, it's not biology, right? It's not that we observe certain features of nature and we have to explain those features of nature. The normative world is a different world. The normative world is a world that we create in accordance with certain ideas. So let me come to your examples, Ben, which I think are interesting examples. So with respect to punitive damages, I think they are a mistake. But I also think that it is significant that there's a division within the legal world generally about punitive damages. That is, by saying that it's a mistake, that punitive damages is a mistake, may move someone to disagree with me. But I don't think it will move anyone to say that what I've said is completely silly, right? It's within the realm of legal and theoretical disagreement. But I think punitive damages are a mistake. With the other example that you mentioned, unconscionability. I think unconscionability is perfectly explainable as a matter of corrective justice. Of course, not every version of unconscionability is, but unconscionability as an idea is perfectly explainable. And one place where one might look for such an explanation is a recent book by my colleague Peter Benson, Justice and Transactions, where he provides a full theory of contract law, including the idea of unconscionability, which is in conformity with corrective justice. Again, when you read his account of unconscionability, one may be moved to disagree with his account of unconscionability. That's fine. That's the give and take of scholarly disagreement. But he does provide a corrective justice view of unconscionability, and so I subscribe to a version of his view. So I think unconscionability is an example of a doctrine that only on certain views of it is inconsistent with corrective justice. That is, if you have an economic analysis of unconscionability, that's going to be inconsistent with corrective justice. But then all economic analysis is inconsistent with corrective justice. There's nothing new in that. But I think if one looks at the doctrine of unconscionability itself and how it works, at least in the common law world, and I suspect also how it works in the civil law world, because Benson's ideas are very similar to Gordby's ideas and go back to notions on this point anyway, and go back to notions of equality of exchange that harken back to Aristotle's book 5 of Nicomachean Ethics, and were extensively developed in the scholastic and neo-scholastic Catholic jurisprudence. So I think that's perfectly consistent with corrective justice. That's a big idea, and if unconscionability were inconsistent with corrective justice, I would be disturbed by it. But I'm not disturbed by it on this explanation, on the Benson kind of explanation. As to whether there are public law intrusions into private law, I think that's actually a very interesting point. And again, I could go on about this at length. The conditions under which there are public law intrusions into private law, I think, are or ought to be very restrictive. And in this forthcoming book on reciprocal freedom, the Oxford University book that Oxford University Press has, I devote 2 of the 8 chapters of that book to the idea of horizontality. That is, to the idea that constitutional rights, which arise in the public law world, that constitutional rights can be significant for private law. And I try to outline the conditions under which that's so. I do not, my original temptation, and I think this may be Peter Benson's temptation still, is to say, well, horizontality doesn't belong in private law at all. My idea in this book is to try a different tack, to say that horizontality is such a widespread phenomenon in many, many different jurisdictions. So, of course, starting in Germany and the European jurisdiction, but also now in England and Canada and South Africa, and I'm sure in the jurisdictions that you're intimately engaged with. It's such a current notion that I think it has to be investigated from the standpoint of private law. And in that chapter, those 2 chapters, I try to outline the conditions under which it's consistent with corrective justice. But I think those are chapters in which I'll get a lot of negative comment from readers, especially readers who are friendly to the views I'm putting forward. So I hope that goes some way to answering, responding to your very interesting observation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It answered more than I expected. I'm deeply thankful to you.
Good.
Thank you, Weinrib. Anyone? Another question? So I think I can pose one question, Professor Weinrib. In your theory, you have 2 main bases or main grounds for this theory. In your book, The Idea of Private Law, you explain first the corrective justice, an Aristotelian ground, and second the Kantian law. And now, today, you mentioned these 2 bases. More corrective justice, but in the end of the presentation, you entered in the Kantian side of this theory. My question is exactly if you think your theory is more a Kantian theory or an Aristotelian theory, the connection of your theory. I would like to hear about that.
Oh, yes. Well, that certainly goes to the heart of the matter. No question about it. Yes, so you're quite correct that I'm inspired by 2 sources, by Aristotle's discussion of corrective justice and distributive justice, and by Kant's doctrine of right. And in the presentation of the 14 Theses, as you observed, I started with Aristotle, in a sense, started with the structure, or started with the way I read Aristotle anyway, as a structural matter. Not everybody reads Aristotle that way, of course. Started with Aristotle's structures and ended with Kant's substance. And if you're going to force me to choose, if you're going to say, are you an Aristotelian or are you a Kantian? I would have to say that I'm a Kantian. Because I follow Kant quite extensively in the analysis of law, and this will become even more evident in this the new book to which I refer, the book on reciprocal freedom, which is basically a Kantian idea. And I'm aware that in a sense, the only thing I'm taking from Aristotle is an interpretation of the structure of private law. That is, I'm not taking on board the full conception, Aristotelian conception of ethics as he sets it out, let alone his broader conceptions. So in that sense, I'm not actually a very good Aristotelian. Over the years, there have been people who have written that where I come out is completely inconsistent with Aristotle's larger notions, more pervasive notions. And that may well be so, because after all, Aristotle did not have an idea of rights. Also, just to sort of point out the point of difference, Aristotle was willing to entertain the idea of natural slavery. I'm not willing to entertain the idea, even entertain it as an idea, that there are natural slaves. I think critics of mine who have pointed out that I've landed up in a place that's not Aristotelian are quite right to point that out. But I have to also confess, I'm not very perturbed by that. I'm not very disturbed by that. So why then don't I just start with Kant and forget about Aristotle entirely? And my reason for doing that, and again, this is controversial with my Kantian friends, my reason for doing that is I want to present Kant's ideas in a non-metaphysical way. I want the presentation to be entirely juridical and not metaphysical. And Kant insists that everybody has to have a metaphysics of morals, which includes justice. I think that, I'm a Kantian. If you ask me whether I accept Kant's metaphysics, I would say yes, I do. But I'm not demanding that my readers accept it. I want to present it as not metaphysical. And the way I've hit upon, maybe it's not a satisfactory way, I await your reaction. What I've hit upon is to start with the idea of a structure. That is not metaphysical. That is a structure that we observe in private law and have always observed in private law. In fact, Aristotle's great creativity was to notice this structure, even though the structure, I think, did not correspond very well, fit very well into his overall ethics at all. But he noticed the structure. So I want to start with the structure because I think the structure has a hold on all of us. We can't deny the correlative structure of the private law relationship. And I want to move from the correlative structure of the private law relationship to Kant in a way that does not require my readers to commit themselves to the Kantian metaphysics. The Kantian metaphysics goes beyond the interests of academic lawyers and should go beyond the interests of academic lawyers. And so in the final analysis, I suppose I am a Kantian who finds a particular book of Aristotle, a particular chapter in Aristotle's book, to be very suggestive as the structure. And I want to use that idea of structure to get into Kant in a way that's entirely juridical and not metaphysical. And of course, on the Aristotelian side, some people have said, John Finitz has commented on this, that my view of Aristotle is completely wrong. That Aristotle is not just talking about structure in those pages. I think that I reject that criticism. I think he is just talking about structure. Aristotle's problem is, in my view, would be how does one reconcile what he's saying about corrective justice with the other thing he says about the nature of virtue. But if you press me, and I gather the point of your question is to press me on whether I'm more of a Kantian than an Aristotelian.
It's a provocation, Professor.
Yes, that's fine. Then my answer is yes, I am more of a Kantian than an Aristotelian. But I have a reason for you, nonetheless, for going back to Aristotle. And the work that I'm presently engaged in, that is, having gotten rid of this book for Oxford University Press, the work that I'm presently engaged in is actually work on the Salamanca School of the neo-scholastic schools that were themselves, of course, heirs to Aristotle. So I hope that's an answer to your question. I'd be interested whether you think it's a satisfactory answer or whether it exposes me to further difficulties.
No, this answer I think is current with your theory, and it's for me a good answer. I think you can defend this point, and I would like to hear you about that. It's important for us to watch, to understand your explanation. And another question that I think is connected with this first one is if you agree that we have a space for distributive justice in law, and this space is just in public law. So we have, it's another important thing for me to emphasize this, that you are not saying that distributive justice or non-correlative relationships are something that is not important for law. Could be important for law, but is not something that you can use to explain private law, but you can use this in public law in another kind of rationality.
Yes. So I'm interested in that comment. So some people have read my views, emphasize the non-distributive nature of private law by saying that I'm a libertarian and I don't allow distributive justice into private law because I don't allow distributive justice at all. That is false. I have always claimed that there are two forms of justice. I've always accepted Aristotle on that point. That corrective justice is not all the justice there is, that there's also distributive justice, which is a different thing. Has a different thing because it has a different structure, because it doesn't insist on this individual correlativity of parties. So, but then the question arises, which I think is a very serious theoretical question. How does one, if one excludes the idea that there is a unified conception of justice and thinks that there are two different kinds of justice, corrective justice and distributive justice, how does one conceptualize the relationship between them? I think that's a really serious question. And again, if I could refer, and I must sound like a walking advertisement, but if I could refer to this forthcoming book, there is a chapter in this book on distributive justice, where I actually deal with it for the first time. I've been thinking about it for a long time, but I deal with it for the first time, where I try to answer the question of how one can conceptualize in some acceptable way the relationship between corrective and distributive justice, while preserving private corrective justice for private law, but yet allowing for distributive justice to operate, and indeed, in my view, to operate precisely because of corrective justice. That is, corrective justice itself creates the need for distributive justice. At least that's what I'm going to argue in this forthcoming, what I have argued in this book that's awaiting publication. But I think the question about the public law nature of corrective justice, of distributive justice, and its the relationship between private and public law, I think is a very serious question that is very difficult to answer. So I try to provide an answer in this book.
And because you mentioned that, for this relationship between corrective justice and distributive justice, you analyze the general justice of Aristotle?
Actually, no, I don't.
No.
No, I don't analyze. I don't refer back to the. Actually, that's an interesting suggestion. But no, I don't refer back to the general justice. I take it as that the problem of the connection between corrective and distributive justice is not explained through general justice. What I'm arguing is that in that chapter is that there's a particular form of unity that is the unity of conceptual sequence. And I try to explain the nature of that kind of unity, which I think is actually crucially important, the idea of conceptual sequence. I think that's a crucially important idea that is evident, I think, in the work of the philosophers of natural right, Kant, and of course Hegel, the idea of a conceptual sequence. But aside from a few pages in Rawls, is, so far as I can see, completely ignored. And I try to explain why that idea of a sequence, of a conceptual sequence, is necessary not only to solve this problem of the relationship between corrective and distributive justice, but to understand the truly internal juridical nature of both corrective and distributive justice. That is, that it's not a question of postulating some external ideal for the law and requiring the law to live up to it, but it's a question of fleshing out the internal conceptual moves within law that are required within law as a whole to account for the relationship between corrective and distributive justice. So I appreciate your suggestion about Aristotle's general justice, but I don't go there. I guess that's confirms both maybe your suspicions and what I said earlier, that I am not actually a very good Aristotelian.
So I will wait your book. I think we can schedule another webinar to discuss, because for us it will be very interesting, very important. So Professor, I don't know if anyone would like to ask one more question. If not, I think we are now in time. So thank you very much again. For us, this was an important, a great moment to discuss your ideas, and we expect to have you again here with us, probably to discuss your next book and try to continue this reflection, this debate about corrective justice, private law, and your entire theory.
Thank you very much. Thank you for setting this up and for arranging this. You know, I would be happy to do this again in connection with this forthcoming book. But I must say I thoroughly appreciated the session this morning, and I very much appreciated the comments, everyone's comments. I thank everyone for participating, especially you, Dr. Dresch, for setting this up in such an efficient way. And I look forward. I hope, speaking more generally, this is just the first of an ongoing series of contacts that we might have in the future. So thank you very, very much.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Thank you, people. Again,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye.